Amara's life had once been simple, though not without its struggles. She had lived in a small, dusty village at the edge of the prairie where the wind swept over golden fields and the sun set in bursts of fire. She had known the warmth of family, the gentle rhythm of community, and the quiet dreams of a future she had yet to define. But all of that changed the day they came for her. It happened in the late afternoon as she was returning from gathering water. The shadows had stretched long across the dirt road when a wagon rolled into the clearing. Its wheels rattled violently over the stones, and she felt a sudden chill, though the sun still beat down. Men jumped out, strangers, rough and silent, with eyes that held no kindness. Before she could run, one of them grabbed her roughly. A hand clamped over her mouth to stifle the scream. Her heart pounded, wild and panicked, as they forced her into the wagon, the world spinning as it jolted over rocks. She fought with every ounce of strength, scratching, kicking, pleading, but her resistance only earned her harsher grips and rougher laughter. Her mind raced, trying to remember stories of women who had escaped, holding on to even the faintest thread of hope. Yet with each passing moment, the realization sank in. This was not a random act of cruelty, it was planned, precise, merciless. When the wagon stopped, Amara was thrust into a dark, damp room, the air thick with smoke and the odor of sweat and alcohol. Men crowded the space, some shouting, others placing bets on the simplest things: how she would move, whether she would cry, how long she could endure. Numbers were scrawled on the wall, marking the women in the room as though they were livestock. She was given no name, no dignity, only a number, a symbol of ownership in this grotesque game. Fear clawed at her chest as she realized that her very life had become someone else's entertainment. Amara's mind tried to resist the panic. She recalled lessons her mother had once whispered. Even when they take your freedom, they cannot take your spirit. She clung to that thought desperately. In the dim light, she observed the other women, some resigned, some defiant, all trapped. She saw the bruises, the hollow eyes, and the flicker of despair that mirrored her own. Yet amidst the terror, there was a quiet, unspoken resilience, a fragile bond that whispered of survival. The men were cruel but methodical. They forced her to obey, to perform for their amusement, testing her endurance, testing her humanity. Each bet placed on her movements, each coin thrown in mockery, was a reminder of her vulnerability. But even as she endured, Amara began a silent calculation, a mental mapping of her captors, their habits, the small cracks in their arrogance that might one day be exploited. She was a prisoner, yes, but not broken yet. And in the darkest corner of that room, where no eyes saw and no hands reached, Amara dared to imagine escape. She whispered her own name to herself, quietly, defiantly. Amara. Not a number, not a statistic, not a fleeting bet. She clung to it like a lifeline, a fragile declaration that she was still herself, still human. It was a small act, but it was hers, a seed of hope in the midst of despair. As night fell and the laughter of the men echoed through the room, Amara lay on the cold floor, exhausted yet unbowed. She did not know what the next day would bring, but she swore silently that no matter the cruelty, she would survive. Somewhere beyond these walls, beyond these cages, there must be freedom, and she would find it. Days turned into weeks, and Amara's world shrank to the dimensions of her cage. The men who had captured her treated her with increasing contempt, their bets growing bolder and crueler as her pregnancy became impossible to ignore. Each day was a test of endurance, both physical and mental. The swelling of her belly, the growing weight of the life inside her, made her movements slower, more awkward. Yet it also made her feel a fragile, stubborn hope. There was a reason to survive, a reason to endure. She had learned to hide her pain, to suppress the groans that came with the relentless kick and turn of her unborn child. Every discomfort was noted, every flutter of movement observed by the men, who began to wager on the baby's actions, whether it would kick at the right moment, scream loudest, or even survive the ordeal. Amara's body, which should have been a sanctuary of life and nurturing, had become another object of their betting table, another spectacle for their amusement. Fear was constant, gnawing at the edges of her mind, but so was anger. How could they take something so sacred, the creation of life, and turn it into sport? She thought often of her mother, of the lessons whispered late at night, even in the darkest cages. Courage is a light that cannot be stolen. That memory became her anchor. She would not allow herself to crumble completely. If she survived this, she would rise not as a victim, but as a mother, protecting her child from the cruelty that surrounded them. Amara's days became an exercise in strategy. She watched the men closely, memorizing their habits, their moods, the smallest details that might someday be used to her advantage. She observed which guards were less attentive, which corners offered shadows to hide in, and how the men reacted to subtle changes. Every look, every laugh, every careless gesture was a clue. Even as her body ached and her belly grew heavy with life, her mind sharpened. She refused to become just a number. The other women whispered tales of those who had tried to resist, of those who had failed and vanished into silence, their names lost forever. Those stories sent shivers down her spine, but they also fueled her determination. Amara understood that survival here required a delicate balance between submission and cunning, between enduring pain and seizing the rare moments of opportunity. As the time of labor approached, the men's anticipation grew. Their bets became more savage, their laughter more cruel. Who will deliver her first scream? Will it be a boy or a girl? They saw only chance and profit, never life, never the fragile humanity within the cage. Amara's body tensed at every word, yet she resolved to protect the baby at all costs. Her child would not be a number, would not be a wager. She would carry the life inside her through this hell, and somehow they would see it as more than a game. In the quiet moments, when the men's attention was elsewhere, Amara allowed herself to feel the faint stirrings of hope. She touched her belly and whispered to the child small words of comfort and courage, promising that they would survive, that she would fight with every ounce of strength left in her. She imagined a life beyond the cage, beyond the smoke-filled room and the mocking laughter, a world where her child could grow free and safe. But fear was always close behind, a constant shadow. Every groan of pain, every tightening of her abdomen reminded her of the danger, of the cruelty waiting to exploit her vulnerability. Yet with that fear came a strange clarity. She would not break. The child inside her had given her a purpose greater than herself. And in that realization, she began to feel the first flickers of defiance that would soon ignite into action. Amara did not yet know how she would escape or who might help her. She only knew that she would endure, that she would survive, and that when the moment came, she would protect her child with a courage that even the cruelest men could not measure. The room seemed to pulse with a cruel rhythm, the constant clatter of coins and shouts blending into a background hum of terror. Amara could feel her body's exhaustion pressing against her mind like a vice, yet she refused to yield entirely. The men had discovered the thrill of wagering on her every move as her labor drew near. Their eyes gleamed with anticipation, the way predators might watch a wounded animal, and their voices rose in a chorus of callous amusement. Amara had learned to anticipate their cruelty. Each day brought a new set of bets: who could make her flinch first, whose taunt would draw the loudest cry, how long she could endure sitting upright without collapsing. Even her eating, her slightest movement, became a spectacle. She realized with bitter clarity that the men no longer saw her as a human being carrying life. She was an instrument of entertainment, a game designed to satisfy their sadistic desires. The numbers scrawled on the walls reinforced that identity. They did not know Amara. They only knew 14. Despite the degradation, she found small ways to reclaim power. In her mind, she catalogued every face, every gesture, every pause. She noticed the men who were overconfident, the ones who laughed the loudest to mask fear. She noted who was slow to react, who lingered too long near the cage. Every detail became a potential advantage, a small crack in the armor of cruelty that surrounded her. These observations became her secret rebellion, a silent declaration that she was watching as intently as she was being watched. The bets escalated further as the hours dragged on. One man wagered on whether she would scream when a piece of bread fell into the dirt. Another bet on whether her water would break before dawn. The sheer audacity and malice of the men left her reeling, yet amid the fear, a stubborn ember of defiance burned. Amara whispered to herself quietly, "You will not own me. Not my pain, not my child, not my name." It was a mantra, fragile yet unyielding, a lifeline to her humanity. The anticipation of labor added another layer of tension. The men speculated about every detail: how long she would endure, whether she would beg for help, whether she would give birth to a boy or a girl. Their excitement was palpable, and it made Amara's skin crawl. They did not understand that beneath her exhaustion, beneath the terror and humiliation, there was a growing resolve. The life inside her stirred, and she knew that this child was her shield, her reason to endure, her promise that she would rise from this darkness. Amara's body ached constantly, every movement a painful negotiation with her growing child. Yet she learned to use the pain to her advantage, masking it when necessary, flinching only when she chose. Each controlled reaction was a subtle act of rebellion, a reminder to herself that even here, even in this cage, she retained some control. She began to imagine the consequences for the men, not out loud, not yet, but in her mind, weaving scenarios where their arrogance would be undone. The other women, silent witnesses of the gambling room's horrors, offered her small gestures of support. A nod, a quick glance, a whispered word. They shared in her fear but also in her quiet resistance, the unspoken acknowledgement that Amara was not yet broken, and neither was the child she carried. Each small act of solidarity strengthened her, weaving an invisible shield against the cruelty around her. By nightfall, the bets had reached a fever pitch. The men's excitement bordered on frenzy, yet Amara, through sheer will, maintained a fragile composure. Her breathing was steady, her mind sharp. She understood that the final hours before labor would be the ultimate test, not just of her body, but of her resolve, her intelligence, and her courage. In the midst of chaos, she felt a spark of hope, that when the moment came, she would survive, and the child would survive, and somehow they would emerge from this hell together. Amara was no longer just a prisoner. She was a fighter, a protector, and a mother-to-be with the quiet power of life itself surging through her. Then deep inside, a promise took root. The cruelty that surrounded her would not define her future, nor the future of the child she would bring into the world. The room was alive with cruel anticipation. The men's voices bounced off the walls in a chaotic chorus of shouts and wagers, their eyes glinting with greed and morbid curiosity. Amara, exhausted and trembling, felt her body tense as the first sharp pangs of labor tore through her. Every contraction was a jolt of pain, a reminder of the vulnerability they sought to exploit. Yet beneath the terror, a deeper force surged, a fierce determination to protect the life within her, no matter the cost. The men circled her like vultures, their bets growing more absurd and grotesque by the minute. "Who will scream first?" One shouted. "Will she make it past the next hour without begging?" Laughed another. Amara's ears rang with the sound of their cruelty, but she focused inward, closing her eyes to block out the spectacle. She drew on every ounce of strength, every memory of resilience and survival she had cultivated in the preceding weeks. She would not allow them to break her. As the labor intensified, her body quaked with effort. Sweat soaked her hair, her clothes clung uncomfortably, and every movement brought a new wave of agony. Yet amidst the pain, she felt the child shifting, responding to her will as if sharing her resolve. A protective instinct flared fiercely, and she instinctively tried to shield her belly to hide the vulnerable life from prying eyes. This small act of defiance, of preserving dignity in the midst of dehumanization, was her first silent victory. The men, drunk with excitement, continued to speculate. "It'll be a boy. He'll be strong. Girl, she screamed first." The bets grew louder, the laughter harsher. Amara gritted her teeth, blocking out the voices as best she could. Her mind became a sanctuary, a place where she could visualize a life beyond the cage, beyond the cruelty. She imagined a quiet room, sunlight filtering through curtains, a child she could hold without fear. That vision strengthened her resolve, giving her the courage to endure the excruciating labor that would have crushed anyone else. As the child began to emerge, Amara felt both terror and awe. The world outside the cage had no place for the horror she was enduring, yet in that moment, life surged with an unstoppable force. She cried out not in pain, but in the pure, raw essence of giving birth, of bringing something innocent into existence despite the cruelty surrounding her. Her voice, though hoarse, was a declaration. She was human, and so was the child she bore. The men's bets and laughter were relentless, but Amara's focus never wavered. She guided the birth with instinct and strength she did not know she possessed, pushing past fear, exhaustion, and humiliation. Every second was an act of defiance, every breath a claim of her dignity. She delivered the baby with a mixture of relief, disbelief, and fierce love. The child's first cry pierced the room, raw and unclaimed, and for a moment it seemed to silence even the men. Cradling the newborn against her chest, Amara's tears mingled with sweat. The men's laughter faltered as they realized that this life was not theirs to control, that it had not been part of their game. The baby's fragile body pressed against hers, a reminder of everything worth fighting for, everything she would protect at all costs. In that moment, she reclaimed her humanity, asserting the simple but profound truth. She and her child were more than numbers, more than bets, more than cruelty. Amara looked up at the men, eyes burning with defiance, and whispered her first words aloud, though barely audible. "You will not touch us. You will not define us." The cage still surrounded her, but her spirit was unshackled. A spark of hope ignited in her heart, the promise that someone, perhaps even a savior, could come to break the chains and restore dignity to both her and her child. And somewhere in the shadows, that someone was watching. The night had grown thick with shadows when the door to the gambling den creaked open. Dust swirled in the faint moonlight streaming through the cracks in the walls, catching in the eyes of the men who had spent the evening in drunken revelry. They barely noticed at first, too absorbed in their bets, until a figure stepped into the dim light, a tall, rugged man with a quiet intensity that cut through the chaos. His boots made no sound on the worn wooden floor, yet his presence seemed to command the room. Elias, a cowboy known in nearby towns for his unyielding sense of justice, had followed rumors of the underground gambling ring. Whispers of cruelty, of women reduced to objects of wagers, had reached his ears, and he could not ignore them. He carried no weapons openly, only the weight of purpose in his stance. Yet the men sensed the danger instantly. There was something in his calm, piercing gaze, a confidence born of skill and experience that unsettled even the most brazen gamblers. Amara, still trembling from the ordeal of childbirth, barely registered the new presence at first. She was hunched over her newborn, shielding the tiny life with her arms, heart still racing from the pain and fear she had endured. But then she saw him, tall, broad-shouldered, eyes scanning the room with a quiet but undeniable authority. Something in his demeanor sparked a flicker of hope within her, a sensation she had not felt since the day of her capture. The men, emboldened by numbers and their own arrogance, sneered at the stranger. "This is private business," one barked. "You don't belong here, cowboy." But Elias did not flinch. He walked slowly, deliberately, eyes never leaving the worst offenders, and his voice, calm yet commanding, filled the room. "Let her go." The words hung in the air, shocking in their simplicity. There was no negotiation, no room for argument. Amara, hearing the tone of certainty in his voice, felt her own body respond with cautious hope. Could someone truly intervene in this place of cruelty? The men laughed nervously, trying to assert dominance, but Elias's presence was magnetic, undeniable, and they instinctively understood that brute force alone would not win this encounter. Elias approached the cage, his gaze steady on Amara. "She's a person," he said quietly, almost to himself, "not a number, not a game." The statement was simple, yet in that moment it carried immense weight. Amara's heart stirred at the recognition of her humanity, a stark contrast to the weeks of degradation she had endured. She dared to look up at him, eyes wide, and felt an unspoken understanding this man could be the salvation she had longed for. The tension in the room tightened like a drawn bow. The men realized that Elias was not a negotiator. They had underestimated his resolve. His movements were deliberate, measured, each step radiating authority and capability. He was a force of nature in human form, and the gambler's confidence began to waver. For the first time, the room that had been ruled by cruelty and bets felt the ripple of fear. Amara clutched her child closer, feeling the heat of hope ignite within her. The stranger, this cowboy, was different. He did not see her as an object of amusement, nor as a pawn in a game of chance. He saw her as a human being, and that recognition was a balm to the months of pain and humiliation she had suffered. As Elias reached the cage, he assessed the locks, the structure, the men guarding it. His hands were steady, his mind precise. Amara realized with a mix of awe and relief that he was about to change everything. The first thread of her nightmare was about to be torn apart. The cowboy's arrival marked the turning point, the beginning of liberation, the first step toward reclaiming her name, her dignity, and the safety of her newborn. The air in the gambling den grew thick with tension. Elias stood a few feet from the cage, his boots planted firmly on the wooden floor, eyes locked on the men who had spent weeks reducing Amara to a number. The room, once filled with laughter, bets, and cruel mockery, fell into an uneasy silence. The men sensed a force they could not intimidate with money, numbers, or bluster. Elias was calm, but the weight of his presence pressed on them like the barrel of a gun. "Let her go," Elias repeated, voice steady and unwavering. This time there was no room for misinterpretation. He did not ask, he commanded. The men exchanged nervous glances, trying to mask their fear with mockery. "Who's gonna make us?" One sneered, fumbling with the last of his coins. "You?" Elias's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Yes," he said simply. His tone carried no threat, yet it was heavier than any gunfire. The gamble of cruelty they had relied on for so long suddenly seemed fragile, brittle, and absurd. For the first time, the men hesitated, unsure if their numbers could save them from the man before them. Amara, cradling her newborn, felt a surge of courage. She had endured so much weeks of fear, humiliation, and exhaustion, but now she was witnessing someone who truly saw her as a person, not a wager. The child stirred in her arms, tiny fists curling instinctively as if sensing the shift in the room. Hope, long buried beneath layers of terror, began to unfurl in her chest. One of the braver or perhaps more foolish gang members stepped forward. "You don't know what you're up against, cowboy." "We make the rules here," he said, trying to assert dominance. The room held its collective breath. Elias's eyes never wavered. He studied the man for a moment, calculating, measuring, and then spoke in a tone that left no room for argument. "I know exactly what I'm up against, and it's not you. It's what you're doing." The words struck harder than any weapon. He spoke not only to the leader but to everyone complicit in the cruelty, exposing the moral rot that fueled their confidence. His calm authority was like ice against fire, freezing their arrogance into hesitation. The men shuffled uncomfortably, their bravado faltering in the face of someone who refused to negotiate injustice. Elias stepped closer to the cage, deliberately slow, deliberate. "You've made a living off fear, off numbers and bets," he continued. "But this ends tonight. She is not yours. She is not a number. She is a person. And I won't allow harm to come to her or this child." His words were steel and fire intertwined, a declaration of intent that resonated through the room. Some of the men laughed nervously, trying to hide their fear, while others instinctively reached for weapons. Elias anticipated every move, his body coiled and ready, eyes sharp, muscles tense. In that instant, he became more than a man. He was a force of justice incarnate, a shield for the helpless, a reckoning for the cruel. Amara, sensing the moment, straightened her posture within the cage. For the first time since her capture, she felt less like prey and more like a partner in survival. The child in her arms was no longer just a symbol of hope, it was a rallying point for courage. She whispered softly to the baby, words of comfort and reassurance as if sharing her newfound strength. "We'll be safe soon. We'll be free." The room braced for chaos, yet in the charged silence it became clear. Elias had taken control without striking a single blow. The confrontation was not yet over, but the first victory was his, the recognition of humanity over cruelty, courage over cowardice. The men realized, slowly and unwillingly, that their games were meaningless against someone who refused to gamble with life. And in that charged silence, the first step toward liberation had been taken. Elias was no longer a visitor. He was a protector, a reckoning, and the harbinger of freedom for Amara and her newborn. The tension in the room had reached a near unbearable pitch. The men who had ruled this den with cruelty and arrogance now stood frozen, unsure how to respond to Elias's unshakable authority. Every muscle in their bodies screamed caution, but pride and greed held them in place. Elias's eyes, steady and piercing, never left the cage where Amara and her newborn huddled, a fragile fortress of life amid a sea of cruelty. Elias stepped closer, assessing the locks and the bars that had turned a human being into a numbered object. They were old but sturdy, a symbol of the calculated oppression that had dominated the den for so long. Yet to him, they were obstacles meant to be broken, not as an act of violence, but as an act of liberation. He had faced far worse than iron and wood, and his determination radiated with a quiet certainty that the men could neither challenge nor ignore. Amara watched him, heart pounding, a mixture of fear and hope surging through her. She had clung to the faintest threads of possibility for weeks, whispering her own name and the child's name in defiance of the dehumanizing numbers scrawled on the walls. Now, the presence of this stranger, this cowboy, promised a chance at reclaiming the life that had been stripped from them. She dared to believe in freedom, though the cage still loomed around them like a cruel reminder. Elias knelt briefly, examining the lock with careful precision. The men, sensing the imminent threat to their control, began to murmur, some nervous, some angry. "Step back." One barked, trying to assert authority. Elias ignored them, his focus unshaken. With a practiced flick of his wrist, he produced a tool from his belt, a simple instrument, yet it carried the weight of justice in his hands. In a few deliberate, measured movements, the lock gave way with a soft click, the sound cutting through the room like a bell of freedom. Amara's breath caught in her throat. The cage door creaked as Elias pushed it open, and for the first time in weeks, she saw the possibility of escape laid before her. Her legs, weak from exhaustion and pregnancy, trembled, but she rose, holding the child close to her chest. The air felt different, charged with the promise of life rather than the stench of cruelty. Elias extended a steadying hand, a lifeline in the storm of fear that had defined her existence for so long. "You're free," he said simply, voice calm but imbued with power. "No one can touch you now." The words carried a weight that no coin or bet ever could. Validation, recognition, the simple truth that she was not a number. The men could only watch, their arrogance faltering as the reality of their vulnerability became clear. For the first time, their control slipped away, undone not by violence, but by the unyielding courage of one man who refused to tolerate injustice. Amara stepped forward, each movement a reclamation of her body and her dignity. She felt the child stir in her arms, tiny hands pressing against her chest, a living testament to survival and resilience. The act of leaving the cage was more than physical. It was symbolic. She was reclaiming her identity, her humanity, and her right to exist beyond the cruelty of the den. The men, once so confident in their power, now wavered, their bets meaningless in the face of liberation. Elias stood beside her, unwavering, a shield against any final act of defiance. The room, once a theater of exploitation, had been transformed in a single moment into a stage of justice and hope. For Amara, the breaking of the cage was not only freedom, it was the first step in reclaiming herself, her child, and her life. The numbers, the bets, the cruelty, they no longer defined her. She was Amara, a mother, a survivor, and a human being who would never again be reduced to a wager. For weeks, Amara had been known only as a number, a dehumanized symbol of entertainment for the cruel and the greedy. Every day, every insult, every wager had stripped her of identity until all that remained was survival instinct. Yet now, standing in the dim light of the gambling den, freed from her cage, she felt a strange, fragile hope stir within her. That hope was cemented the moment Elias looked directly at her, not as a prize or a spectacle, but as a human being deserving dignity. "You're Amara," Elias said softly, almost reverently. "And this," he added, nodding toward the newborn cradled in her arms, "is yours. Your child has a name, too. You decide it." His words, simple yet profound, reverberated through her being. For the first time in weeks, she felt recognized, acknowledged, and respected. Her identity, once stolen, was now restored not through ritual or ceremony, but through the quiet, powerful act of being seen as herself. Amara blinked, tears threatening to spill, emotions tangled between relief, disbelief, and lingering fear. She had endured cruelty so deep it had felt unending, yet in that moment she realized that her life had not been extinguished. Elias's gesture was more than kindness. It was a restoration of humanity, a reclaiming of the essence of who she was. She pressed her child closer, feeling the tiny heartbeat against her chest, a reminder that the life she nurtured was hers to name, hers to protect. She whispered her child's name aloud, testing the sound, letting it settle into reality. Leora. The name, meaning light, felt like a promise, a declaration that they would rise from darkness into a future defined by love, choice, and freedom. The baby cooed softly, as if sensing the weight of its new identity, its tiny body pressing instinctively against her in acknowledgement of safety. Elias watched, a quiet, steady presence, giving her space to reclaim what had been stolen. "They took everything else from you," he said, voice gentle yet firm, "but they cannot take your name, they cannot take your life, and they cannot take this child from you. Not now, not ever." The words were not merely comforting, they were empowering. For Amara, they were a declaration that her suffering, while real and enduring, did not define her. She was more than pain, more than fear, more than the numbers scrawled on the walls. She was Amara, The other women in the den, some still trembling with fear, some watching from the shadows, noticed the change. A spark of hope seemed to ripple through them, fragile but unmistakable. To see one of their own reclaimed by identity and dignity reminded them that survival and humanity were not mutually exclusive, even in the face of relentless cruelty. Amara's naming of herself and her child became a small beacon of resistance, a quiet defiance against the dehumanization they had all endured. Amara took a deep breath, inhaling the air of freedom and possibility. Her eyes met Elias's, gratitude and something deeper trust, perhaps even a flicker of attachment reflecting silently between them. There was no rush, no obligation, only the shared understanding that she and her child had been seen, and that recognition was enough to begin healing. For the first time since her capture, Amara allowed herself to hope. She was more than a number. Her child was more than a wager. Together they had names, identities, and most importantly, a chance at life beyond the walls that had imprisoned them. In that moment, the act of naming became a rebirth, not just for the child, but for Amara herself. She was no longer a victim. She was a mother, a survivor, and a human being whose life and choices were hers to reclaim. The first steps out of the den felt surreal. Amara clutched Leora tightly against her chest, the tiny life a pulsing reminder of everything worth fighting for. Elias led the way, calm and deliberate, yet his senses were sharpened to the tension that crackled like static in the air. The men inside the den, once so confident and cruel, now seethed with frustration and disbelief. Their wagers, their control, their very sense of power had been shattered in moments, and some could not bear it. They were coming after them. Elias moved swiftly, taking the narrow alleys and back streets with the surety of someone who knew the terrain and trusted instinct. Amara, still weak from labor, stumbled occasionally, but Elias's steadying hand kept her upright. Fear pressed down on her chest like a stone. Every shadow could conceal a pursuer, every distant noise a threat, but beneath it all, a thread of hope wove through her heart. They were alive, and more than that, they were free to fight for their future. The first pursuers emerged as darkness settled over the prairie streets. Shouts echoed behind them, rough voices calling threats and promises of recapture. Amara's pulse quickened, but she refused to panic. She had endured weeks of terror and cruelty. The threat now was mere continuation of what she had already faced and survived. Leora cooed softly, and Amara whispered reassuringly, "We're almost there. We'll be safe soon." "I promise." Her voice, though quivering, carried strength, a mother's resolve radiating outward. Elias, ahead of her, guided them with precision. He knew the layout of the town better than most, had memorized the safe routes, and anticipated the pursuers' moves. Every turn, every sudden change in direction, was a calculated effort to put distance between them and the men who had tormented Amara for so long. The wind whipped across the open plains, carrying with it the faint scent of freedom. The air felt different than the staleness of the den, lighter, charged with possibility. The chase was not without danger. One of the men broke into the path ahead, a crude weapon in hand, eyes wild with desperation. Elias didn't hesitate. In a swift, fluid motion, he disarmed the man, knocking him unconscious without causing lasting harm. Amara's heart raced as she witnessed his skill and precision. He was more than a protector. He was a force of justice. The other pursuers faltered at the sight, realizing that raw aggression alone would not overcome him. As the night stretched on, the pair moved through forests and open fields, the baby sleeping peacefully against Amara's chest. Elias kept a careful watch, scanning for dangers, signaling silently when they needed to move or hide. Amara marveled at his calm, almost effortless command of the situation. His presence was both shield and reassurance, a constant in the midst of chaos. Hours passed, the pursuers gradually falling behind as Elias's careful planning paid off. They reached a secluded clearing, a small cabin hidden among trees and rocks, far from the den's reach. Amara sank to the ground, exhausted, yet her spirit felt unburdened for the first time in weeks. Leora stirred in her arms, and Amara smiled through tears, the first genuine smile since her captivity began. Ilias crouched beside her, a quiet presence, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We're safe for now," he said, voice steady. "But this is just the beginning. The past may haunt us, but it will not define us. You and your child have names, you have life, and we'll protect it." For Amara, the flight from the den was more than physical, it was symbolic. A journey from dehumanization to identity, from fear to courage. She had survived cruelty, reclaimed her name, and safeguarded the life she had fought so fiercely to bring into the world. The path ahead would be challenging, but for the first time she faced it not as prey, but as a mother and survivor, ready to claim the life that was rightfully hers. The first light of dawn broke across the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of gold and rose. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Amara breathed without the weight of fear pressing on her chest. The cabin where she and Leora had taken refuge stood quiet and still, nestled among trees that swayed gently in the morning breeze. Outside, the world seemed larger, freer, and somehow imbued with promise. Amara held Leora close, feeling the tiny warmth of her body against her own. The baby's eyes blinked open, wide and innocent, drinking in the new world with curious wonder. Amara smiled, a smile that carried relief, love, and the faintest trace of joy. She whispered softly, "This is our beginning, my little light. No one can take you from me. No one can take our life away." The words were more than reassurance. They were a vow, a commitment to the future she and her child would build together. The journey to this point had been harrowing. Months of captivity, humiliation, and cruelty had threatened to strip Amara of everything, her dignity, her strength, her identity. Yet through it all, she had survived. She had endured the cruelty of men who saw her as nothing more than a wager. She had given birth in a cage, protecting her child even as the world around them descended into chaos. And now, with Elias by her side, she had reclaimed her name, her child's name, and her life. Elias stood nearby, watching over them with quiet vigilance. His presence was steady and reassuring, a constant that anchored Amara's fragile hope. Yet he did not dominate or dictate. He simply offered protection, respect, and trust. For the first time, Amara realized that not all men were cruel or self-serving. Some could be allies, protectors, and companions, people who recognized humanity where others saw only objects. She met his gaze, gratitude, and a tentative warmth reflecting between them. The cabin offered more than shelter. It represented a chance to heal. Amara began to imagine a life filled with small joys, teaching Leora to speak, watching her take her first steps, feeling the sun on their faces without fear of shadows lurking behind. The trauma of the past lingered like a faint echo, but in this quiet dawn, it felt distant, contained. The world outside the cabin was no longer a place of terror, it was a canvas upon which she could rebuild, a space where she could reclaim what had been stolen. As days passed, Amara and Leora settled into a rhythm of safety and care. They tended to the small garden outside, prepared simple meals, and allowed themselves moments of laughter that had been impossible in the den. Elias occasionally helped, always respectful of their space, never intrusive, a guardian whose presence reminded them that they were no longer prey. Slowly, the cabin became a home, not just a shelter, but a symbol of freedom and possibility. Amara often held Leora and whispered their shared story, not as a tale of despair, but as a testament to survival and courage. She spoke of the darkness they had escaped, of the cruelty they had endured, but also of the light they had found in each other and in the unexpected protector who had intervened. In these moments, Amara realized that the past, while painful, had also forged her resilience and determination. She would carry those lessons forward, teaching Leora not just to survive, but to thrive. And as the sun rose higher, spilling warmth over the prairie, Amara allowed herself to hope fully for the first time. The cage was far behind her. The numbers, the cruelty, the bets, they existed only in memory. What lay ahead was life reclaimed, freedom embraced, and love given freely. In this new beginning, Amara, Leora, and Elias faced the future together, a future defined not by fear, but by courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds of humanity. For Amara, the journey had ended not in despair, but in the quiet triumph of survival and identity. She had been given her name back, her child a name, and their lives a chance at freedom. And in that freedom, they found hope, the most precious inheritance of all.